the NAACP Legal Defense Fund of 2006, 45.2% of death row inmates are white, while 41.8% are black. However, according to the Census Bureau of 2000, 75% of the U.S. population is white, while blacks represent only about 12%. Hence, statistically, African Americans are overrepresented on America's death row. Now, what a number of death penalty opponents will have you believe is that simply African Americans commit more murders than white people. However, as social scientist Michael K. Brown astutely notes, it is more accurate to say that more African Americans are arrested for and convicted of capital murder. And there is a fine line between those two, given what we already know about the tendency of our system to punish innocent people. Furthermore, Brown continues by stating that these studies fail to control for non-racial variables of sentencing, or account for the fact that African Americans disproportionately enter the criminal justice system at an earlier phase in their lives. And given that our nation has a recidivism rate of about 70% of people re-entering prison, and given that 2/3 of death row inmates have prior convictions, we see that African Americans, by virtue of their relationship to the criminal justice system, are more likely to work their way towards being accused or perhaps even committing more violent crimes. Hence, the death penalty reinforces and articulates racial injustice in our society. But also, racial injustice takes place within the courtroom itself. A 1998 report of the American Bar Association found a pattern of race of victim or race of defendant discrimination in 96% of states. Since 1976, 213 black on white convictions have resulted in death sentences, compared to 15 white on black. A multitude of statistical studies, starting with the Belda study in the 1987 McCleskey versus Kemp Supreme Court decision, have controls for upwards of 80 non-racial variables, and still found that a black culprit and a white victim was the most likely combination to generate a death sentence. Also, it was found in the Supreme Court decision of Miller L. versus Dredke in 2005 that Dallas County removed 91% of eligible black jurors from capital cases by virtue of attempts by the prosecution. Prosecutors were 5 times more likely to seek the death sentence for black on white murders, according to the South Carolina Law Review of autumn 2006. Also, a number of studies, such as mock trial studies launched by Bauer, Steiner, and Sandys in 2001, have noted that jurors tend to base their decisions on racial stereotypes. The Washington Post of March 21, 2004 shows that death penalty supporters are about 1/3 more likely to have prejudiced views of African Americans. Thus, prosecutors have an interest and a tendency to construct juries that are more likely to not only generate death sentences, but sentence African Americans to death, and also choose jurors who have racist tendencies. For example, we might look to the words of Victor Walther, a juror in the case of African American Gary Sterling in Texas, who, during the trial, was quoted as saying, quote, "Sometimes those niggers will start hollering and cursing, and pretty soon they'll start shooting." These are the types of people that manage to wind up on juries because of prosecutorial strategies and incompetent defense attorneys. Finally, according to the Southern Law Review of autumn 2006, police more rigorously investigate murders of whites and blacks. 1.6% of white and black murders end up in death sentences. Prosecutors just don't care. Black victims don't get a day in court. And a final dimension of capital punishment that we need to briefly explore is its thoroughly cruel and unusual nature. Now, there are a number of ways that we can investigate this, but one of the most salient is the targeting of mentally retarded and mentally ill individuals. Now, it is worth noting that in 2002, the Supreme Court outlawed the execution of mentally retarded individuals. However, it is also worth noting that you are only as mentally ill as you are able to prove. For instance, Marvin Lee Wilson, who has an IQ of about 61, 70 is called out for mental retardation, has been on death row since 1994. Now, while it is well documented that he is mentally retarded, on appeals, his defense attorney failed to file paperwork to prove that he was mentally retarded. A court-appointed attorney. Indeed, you are only as mentally retarded as you are wealthy enough to prove that you are. And this says nothing of the fact that mentally ill people are still going to death row. For instance, 85% of people on death row, according to the American University Law Review, November 2006, have damaged frontal lobes, a condition which impairs judgment. However, court-appointed defense attorneys rarely, if ever, investigate this dimension of their defendants because they simply don't have the time to. And prosecutors have no interest in exploring these dimensions. Now, these are just a few reasons to oppose capital punishment. But the important thing to keep in mind is that we ought to resist the typical pro-death penalty tendency to separate the death penalty from its context and realize that it is inseparable from an unjust American society.
Thank you.
Their side of the issue, also for 10 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Brianna Becker, and I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Nick Perlowski and Curtis Waldo. We are representing the Young Conservatives of Texas, and on their behalf, I'd like to thank each of you for coming tonight to support these two groups as well as their exchange of ideas. And as stated, we are here tonight to discuss and to take a closer look at the practice of capital punishment in the United States, and to discuss the implications of this institution, as well as its future in this country. Many of you are here to express support for the movement to absolve this punishment in the nation's judicial system. And although my colleagues and I respect your sentiments, we are here to dissipate damaging rumors through factual evidence, statistics, and studies which support the underlying logic and philosophy of the death penalty. In doing so, we stand to defend it as a proper tool of justice to be used by the judicial system where merited in a just, proper, and efficient way to the benefit of society and to the detriment of those who wish to destroy it. Believing in the death penalty requires a fundamental belief that there are some ultimately heinous crimes which cannot be avowed in any other manner but with the ultimate punishment available in this physical world. It is a belief that our government has the duty to the victims of these barbarous crimes to show society that certain acts are so heinous, so abhorrent, the execution is the only possible sentence, that they are not accepted within civilized society. Jennifer Erdman and Elizabeth Pena were 14 and 16 years old, respectively. They were friends who attended the same high school I did in Houston, only 10 years before me. On a sunny June 24th in 1993, the girls spent the whole day together and far into the night. They were last seen that night about 11:15 when they left a friend's apartment to head home. They knew they would be late if they took their normal path home down busy streets, passing a sexually oriented business and several apartment complexes. So they decided to take a well-known shortcut home through a city park in Elizabeth's neighborhood. But they never made it home that night. According to one of the accused in what would become the infamous Pena-Erdman murder case, that night consisted of continued drinking and shooting the breeze for him and his fellow gang members. When Peter Cantu, not to be confused with their Cantu, it's a different case, one of the members who saw Jenny and Elizabeth walking that night, he told his fellow gang members that he wanted to jump them and beat them up. The gang members ran and grabbed Elizabeth and pulled her down the incline off into the railroad tracks. For the next hour or so, these innocent young girls were subjected to the most brutal gang rapes that most of the investigating officers had ever encountered in their professional careers. The confessions of the gang members that were used at trial indicated that there was never any less than 2 men on each of the girls at any one time, and that the girls were repeatedly raped for the entire hour. One of the gang members later said during the brag session that by that time he had got to one of the girls. She was, quote, loose and sloppy. One of the boys boasted of having, quote, virgin blood on him. The youngest gang member, only 14 years old, said he was repeatedly told by Peter Cantu to, quote, get some. And when the rapes finally ended, the horror was far from over. The gang members took Jenny and Elizabeth from the clearing into a wooded area, leaving the juvenile behind, saying that he was too little to watch. Jenny was strangled with the belt of one of the members, with 2 murderers pulling on each side until the belt broke. Part of the belt was left at the murder scene, and the rest was found in his home. After the belt broke, the killers resorted to using the girl's own shoelaces to finish the job. One of the murderers later complained that, quote, the bitch just wouldn't die, and that it would have been much easier with a gun. Elizabeth was also strangled with her shoelaces after crying and begging the gang members not to kill her, bargaining, offering to give them her phone number so that they could, quote, get together again. The next morning, after realizing their daughters were not home, the girls' parents began to frantically look for him. But only days later, after a police search, did they spot the 2 badly decaying bodies of Jenny and Elizabeth in a clearing next to the bayou. Fortunately, the police managed to keep the girls' parents from entering the woods and seeing their daughters' brutalized bodies, but they were unable to escape the horror themselves. Hardened, lifelong cops got tears in their eyes when talking about the scene more than a year later. The bodies were very badly decomposed, even for 4 days in Houston's brutal summer heat.